Hello, my name is David Malone. I am the rector, in other words, the head of the United Nations University System. It's really a confederation of research institutes around the world, some of which engage in graduate level teaching, as we do in Tokyo. And I'm also an Under-Secretary General of the United Nations. We have a public speaker series at UNU. We don't broadcast it on our website because the engagements are an hour long, and that's a long time in any of your lives. But we do like to bring you the highlights of what has been or will be discussed. Today we have with us Paul Blustein, a noted international writer on dysfunction in the international trading, economic, and financial systems. Before that, for many years, he was a journalist. He worked at Forbes, he worked at the Wall Street Journal, and for many years at the Washington Post, all of them great institutions of the media. When he retired from the Washington Post, he moved on to the Brookings Institution as a journalist in residence, and since then, he's refashioned himself as a writer of highly readable, but at the same time exceptionally well-researched books on how things can go wrong spectacularly in international economic cooperation. His book, The Misadventures of the Most Favored Nations, on a deadlock in the Doha round in, I think it was 2009, reads like a send-up of multilateral economic diplomacy. Extraordinarily, of course, it's all true. Wild egos on the loose, very significant interests of the countries involved at stake, and ultimately, after a lot of brinkmanship, a spectacular failure. So it makes a wonderful book. More recently, in fact, in 2013, he published a book called Off Balance. He's now a senior fellow at the Center on International Governance Innovation in Canada, although he lives here in Japan. And Off Balance deals with aspects of the recent financial and economic crisis globally. And so that's what we're going to turn to now. Paul, welcome. Great to have you here.
Thank you very much.
And so right into the heart of our subject, you've been following as a specialist, but also I think with the journalist's trained eye for the absurd, what has been going on globally since the beginning of the crisis in 2007, which greatly intensified in 2008. And you chose to focus on, I think, 3 or 4 institutions that you thought were particularly important. Tell us more.
Well, for example, the Financial Stability Forum was one that I looked at. Now, this is an institution that few people have heard of, but it's quite important for a number of reasons. Now, I have to admit, starting right off the bat, that it no longer exists. So why focus on it? Well, it no longer exists, but it was replaced by an institution called the Financial Stability Board. And the similarity in those names reflects the fact that really they're essentially the same institution. Financial Stability Board has been given an extra mandate, some extra powers, and it has some extra countries as members of it, which is good. They've invited in some of the countries that were excluded before, the big emerging markets, Brazil, China, India, and so forth. I looked at the Financial Stability Forum because it was set up after the Asian financial crisis in the late 90s. The idea being that it would coordinate efforts to look for future crises, try to scour the horizon and see where the vulnerabilities were. And they tried, they really tried, but they completely failed. I was able to persuade some of the people I interviewed. I interviewed quite a number of people for this book, and I was able to persuade at least a few of them to give me access to notes of the meetings. This is a very, very secretive group. It was very high powered. They had people in it like Tim Geithner, who everyone recognizes. He was then president of the New York Federal Reserve Bank. People like Mark Carney, who's now governor of the Bank of England, was then governor of the Bank of Canada. some very high-powered people were in it. But the meetings were totally behind closed doors, and they would really, and the only, I mean, it wasn't as secret as, you know, the National Security Agency, but it was a very you know, private group. They wanted to have their discussions in confidence because, after all, they were talking about market-sensitive issues. And I was able to get notes of most of the meetings, records of what was actually said. And you know, they really were trying to figure out where the vulnerabilities lay in the system. Where did countries need to concentrate their efforts to try to figure out, you know, did action need to be taken? And what you saw was that they were looking at sort of everything and yet nothing. They were looking at so many different things, and the meetings became so repetitive, and they kept looking at all the same thing. You know, they would look, what if there's a terrorist attack? Are we ready for that? What if the Doha round of WTO, of World Trade negotiations fails? Will that have a big market impact? They were looking at all these different things. And they were looking at some of the things that turned out to have a big effect on the crisis. The housing bubble in the United States, and some of the exposure of some of the banks. But they didn't look very carefully at that because they were looking at so many other things, and they didn't think that was necessarily a huge problem. So
too much white noise.
Yes, I mean, and what this, it's not because these people are stupid. I mean, believe me, I've interviewed many of them. They're much smarter than I am. They're much smarter and they're much more knowledgeable about how financial markets work than I am. But that's what's so scary about this whole thing is that even though they're very capable, if all we had to do was replace, you know, dumb and incompetent or venal public servants with you know, really, you know, smart and noble and far-sighted ones, well, then we wouldn't have such worries about the global financial system. But it's gotten so complex, and so much of it is under the control of national governments, even though capital flies around the world with just a flick of a button, as we all know. So the ability of these international bodies to exercise any real oversight and control is limited, and that's what's disconcerting about what.
Well, the miracle was in many ways that after a major bank failure in the United States, a tremendous shock to the system, various actors in the U.S., public actors, were able to come together, agree on some very radical steps, regardless of the ideology of the party in power, move ahead with those. They probably saved us from the very worst. But subsequently, one got the impression that when decision-making moved to a wider circle of individuals and countries, it became much harder to be action-oriented. And in effect, the system in many ways went into systems overload. And that's just a casual observation of a newspaper reader. But I was wondering how you made sense of all of this.
Yes, I think that's quite accurate. The countries did come together at the London G20 summit in April of 2009. They agreed to do a lot of things together. It had the gave the superficial impression of the world, everybody pulling the oars, you know, in basically in unison. And it was good, you know, it certainly was a high watermark in the sense that it was, you know, better than the alternative of, because, I mean, the historical comparison that people kept worrying about was a conference that took place in London in 1933. And as you can guess, just from the date of that conference, it didn't lead to anything particularly good. In fact, it was kind of a low watermark of international cooperation during the Depression. So countries came together. They, you know, they all agreed to stimulate their economies, but in some ways, this is misleading because countries were going to stimulate their economies individually anyway. It was in their individual self-interest, and also it's not very painful for a government to say, well, we want to spend more and tax less. But you know, it gave a good impression to the markets that you know, they were concerned that countries were kind of maybe going off in different directions, because during the really worst part of the crisis in the fall of 2008, there had been some really serious periods of time where countries were kind of going off on their own. A classic example of that being when the Irish government guaranteed all the deposits, all the liabilities entire liabilities of their banking system without telling anybody that they were going to do it. I mean, that was an unbelievably unilateral move. They thought they had to do it to save their system, but when a country does something like that, the risk is that all the other deposits will flee to that country because, well, if you're guaranteed by the government, then it's safe to put it. And then, of course, the money flees out of banks of other countries where there isn't such a guarantee. So there's been all this.
And making it even more surprising, Ireland was and is a member of the European Union.
Yes.
So that pointed to another fragility in the system. This union we've become used to, which we mostly think of as a very good thing in international relations, showing itself to be considerably disunited in this crisis.
You mean the European Union?
Yes.
Well, yeah. Yeah. Well, what can one say? This institution, was set up with such high-minded ideals. I think much more for political than economic reasons. And many of the architects said at the time that they were well aware that creating a monetary union, not just a trade union, not just a customs union as they have in Europe, which is a very easy thing, relatively easy thing to work out, certainly compared to a monetary union. They agreed to have a common currency, which entails all sorts of obligations of member states to try to act in unison, to harmonize fiscal policy, not to be too indisciplined, and to harmonize regulation. And they recognized that they needed to do a lot more when they set it up. But they said, well, as it goes forward, maybe there will be a crisis which will force countries to harmonize. Well, they got it.
And it hasn't really brought about much harmonization as far as one can make out.
Well, Martin Feldstein, who's a pretty brilliant American economist, was, of course, chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Reagan, predicted sort of famously in the late 90s. A lot of American economists were very skeptical of the euro. He was probably the most skeptical. And he said, this could, instead of stopping these countries from going to war, it could actually lead to war because they'd get so angry with each other if in a crisis. And of course, we all remember the pictures of Greeks carrying, demonstrating in the streets, carrying signs showing, Chancellor Merkel with swastikas. And of course, the Germans were absolutely outraged at the stories of profligacy by their Southern European fellow Europeans. So feelings, yes, I think are quite bruised.
And today we see a lot of that tension moving to other ostensibly unrelated fields like migration, but they're part of a bundle of international tensions, many of them extending way beyond the transatlantic region, brought about by this crisis, in which developing countries in relative terms have done better than the industrialized world of first in major financial crises since I've been alive, at least. And a great deal of it was new to us, this idea of a major banking crisis. In the United States, the epicenter of the world economically, that really hadn't occurred to most of us. It clearly hadn't occurred to the American government, either Congress or the executive. And the way it spread, and then the way also tension grew between countries like the United States, perhaps even Canada, and Europe over whether Europe was doing enough to solve its crisis. How did this play into your tale?
Well, I'm actually now working on a book about the IMF's role in the Eurozone crisis, which, and I'm still in the process of researching it, but it's absolutely, it's a crucial theme. The American government was tearing its hair out with concern because, of course, the Eurozone is a huge part of the global economy, and if it really implodes economically, the U.S. Financial system would have suffered pretty, an additional. I mean, after having started the crisis in the first place with an implosion of our own in the United States, which of course ended up in certainly contributing to the crisis in the Eurozone, to have that then kind of ricochet back across the Atlantic, and they were I think quite rightly convinced from the beginning that the Europeans weren't getting ahead of the crisis, that they were doing just the minimum to reach some kind of agreement that they could go out and sort of hold up and say we've reached an agreement, and markets would.
So they were containing rather than managing the crisis, in sort of a North American view.
Yes, oh, absolutely. And the IMF, I mean, because the Europeans have so much of the voting power at the IMF, they were in some ways able to kind of hijack it. I mean, the IMF was giving its good housekeeping seal of approval. It's the approval of the international community on agreements and rescues, particularly in Greece, which really a lot of people at the IMF felt had no prospect of lasting very long. And as we saw, that sort of pessimism was quite
well, there are many ironies for the IMF because the industrialized countries, Europe specifically, had always argued that a European should be head of the IMF because the Europeans knew what they were doing on economic management. When they ran the very talented, actually, Christine Lagarde to be head of the IMF, the argument was, well, we need a European because we're in the worst crisis imaginable, and so it has to be a European. I think happily it has been Christine Lagarde, but at the same time, the IMF in many ways has been instrumentalized by European expediency rather than perhaps sound economic management.
Yes, I agree. I thought, I mean, I've always been an admirer of Christine Lagarde. I got to know her first when she was trade minister of France, because when I was working on my book about the World Trade Organization, and I remember I interviewed her when she was economy minister, finance minister of France, and wow, what an incredibly impressive person. And then, this episode we all remember where Dominique Strauss-Kahn, who was then managing director of the IMF, was arrested in New York, and suddenly the IMF was leaderless, and the Europeans had promised. They said, this is the last time we will, with Strauss-Kahn, they had said he would be the last one that they would kind of force on the world, where they would exercise this prerogative they have had ever since the IMF was created after World War II. With this, he would be the last one where the Europeans would say, we insist on having a European. From now on, it will really be an open merit-based process. But when this, of course, when Strauss-Kahn was arrested, it was right in the middle of one of the worst parts of the Eurozone crisis. And they said, oh, no, we still have to have a European. And it was completely illogical. It would have been as if the Asians had said in the middle of the Asian crisis, well, we have to have an Asian be head of the IMF. This Asian must be in charge of this agency that's providing loans. It's like when a company goes bankrupt, they don't say, or they're going down, or they're desperate for a loan to save them from bankruptcy. It doesn't make sense for the company to say, well, we have to have one of our people as head of the bank that's making a decision about whether to lend to us. It just doesn't make sense. But the Europeans had such control over the IMF, they were able to impose.
And also there's been a co-conspiracy between the United States and the Europeans. The United States traditionally provides the head of the World Bank.
Guilty.
In a way, if there had no longer been a European at the IMF, it would have become much harder for the United States to sustain its preference for an American at the bank.
Absolutely.
All of that being said, we have seen how difficult it is for even a very powerful institution like the IMF to deal effectively with problems as large as those of a European Union in crisis or the United States in crisis. They are good at smaller crises, even the crisis in the Russian Federation 12 or 15 years ago, I forget exactly when it was, they actually helped manage very well. But the scale of the Russian Federation is so much smaller than the two largest economic regions.
Yes, the IMF, I mean, part of its problem is it's become outgunned. The markets are so much bigger than the resources the IMF has. And what the IMF does is it lends hard currency, money to people always wonder, why do countries need money? I mean, can't they just get, whoever the mint is, to just print it? Well, because countries need, the way our system works, the way the world economy works, I should say. If a country wants to import goods, it needs dollars, they need yen, they need hard currencies that are usable in international exchange. The IMF can provide that to them because it has a kind of a kitty that all the countries put money into. But the idea is that they will give a country enough to sort of like a short-term loan, just to tide you over until you can get back on your feet and make your country sustainable again. Do the right things so that you'll be able to repay your creditors and cover all your bills. They can do that for a country of manageable size. Even, I must say, even with countries of manageable size, they often get things wrong. I mean, during the Asian crisis, the Indonesian example, I think, it's certainly one of their greatest disasters. Argentina, again, not a huge economy. I mean, a medium size. Not tiny, but again, really one of the great, to use the technical term, cock-ups of the IMF's history was the Argentine crisis in 2001, 2002, which is still reverberating today because Argentina is back in crisis. Yes, it's back in crisis. But so even the medium-sized countries they have difficulties with in terms of getting it right, in terms of figuring out what needs to be done. Because global markets, they are so global, and money can move so fast. And when one creditor or a group of creditors thinks that it's time to panic and bolt, then they all go like a herd of buffalo.
Absolutely, and in spite of market worship over the last 20 or 30 years, we realize that markets are totally irrational at times. Yes. And so having the markets in charge of everything is not a good idea. No. On the other hand, stifling markets isn't a great idea either. So we're left with, if we come out of this crisis, as we seem to be perhaps beginning to do, a great deal of thinking to do on the shape of the international financial and economic system. Any headline ideas for that before we end?
In my most recent book, I proposed an idea that I've likened. I think the chances of it happening. I'll just preface it by saying, when I've done PowerPoint presentations, I've shown pigs flying to give an idea of how likely I think this is. But I've proposed that these institutions take a leaf from the World Trade Organization, which has a really enforceable system of tribunals for deciding disputes among countries. And so if countries appear to be going off in a direction that is likely to cause financial instability globally or problems for their neighbors, I think it would be great if countries could agree on a system of rules for that would be enforceable by tribunals that could impose sanctions on the offending countries. I think the chances of this happening again are it's like pigs flying. But if you could be king of the world, which I'm always required to be at the end of my books. I'm very uncomfortable with it. I'm a journalist. I like writing about what went wrong, going and talking to people about what went wrong, and proposing solutions is definitely not my forte. But I'm always obliged to come up with a solution. And I do think that most people who look at this, who would be king of the world, would come up with something like that.
Well, thank you very much. You're spectacularly good at writing about financial and economic disasters. So we'll look forward to the book on the IMF, and we're grateful for the last two. You're really building up a trove of knowledge which you're sharing with all of us in this area. For those of you viewing us online, thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to have something for you again before too long. Many thanks.